Hi there, everyone. I'm Lauren Burchard, Director of Historical Programs at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. As always, we're delighted that you've joined us today. We're so happy to welcome back our crew from the Capitol Visitors Center. They are going to be speaking today about the launch of their new podcast, Shaping History, Women and Capitol Art. And we're joined also by the curator of the Architect of the Capitol. So we'll get to all of those folks in just a moment. I'll also note that we'll be recording this podcast or this webinar today, and that recording will be made available shortly after today's webinar to everyone who registered. And eventually it will be available through USCHS.org. I will turn it over now to Jane Campbell, President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome to all of our participants to our ongoing series where we try to identify how you can find out more about the Capitol in these times of pandemic where we're doing careful social distancing, where the Capitol was closed to public tours. And so we've been in partnership with the Capitol Visitor Center as they have creatively tried to figure out new and imaginative ways for people to understand what's going on in the Capitol itself and share the extraordinary features of what we call the Temple of Democracy. This building has really been built and continually is being rebuilt in a way that is to invite the public to participate in our democracy. And so we have to be real creative when it's closed for public tours. So we're going to talk today about a new idea that has been launched by the Capitol Visitor Center, our podcasts. And as always, we want to thank the members and supporters of the United States Capitol Historical Society, for it is only your generous donations that make it possible for these webinars to come to you and for the work of the Historical Society, which has been going on for over 50 years with our congressional charter to create an informed citizenry worthy of the ideals put forth by our founders. So please join us, continue to contribute. There are a variety of ways you can contribute, including purchasing our fine products. You can see I am modeling for you today one of our brooches. We have some jewelry that is reminiscent of the art in the Capitol, ornaments, bookends, all kind of those commemorative items which normally you would be able to buy at the Capitol Visitor Center, but since it's closed, you have to go to our website and get it online. So that is the promotion that you have to endure in order to understand this is how we make these things possible. Today, we have an incredible panel for you. Janet Clemens is the host of the Capitol Visitor Center's first podcast series called Shaping History, Women in Capitol Art. Janet has been serving as a Capitol Visitors Guide for more than 10 years and a public historian for more than 20 years. And she brings her historical research, her narrative design, her experience in public speaking to this creative project. She comes, with distinguished background, with a master's in public humanities from Brown University. And her earlier research and the writing that she's done on women artists and art in the Capitol was really the foundation for this podcast. We're also joined by Marcey Frutchey, who was with us before when we highlighted the video tour of the Capitol that she had produced. And we're happy to welcome you back, Marcey. Marcey is the videographer for the United States Capitol Visitor Center and has been doing that for the past 3 years. She is an award-winning independent filmmaker, graduate of the Peter Stark Producing Program at the University of Southern California, and is the producer, director of the podcast. And today she leads a team of the CVC staff that helps to develop ideas for new multimedia projects. And we have Michele Cohen. Michele is the curator for the architect of the Capitol and has been doing that since October 2015. And her job is to oversee the curator division, and she is responsible for the stewardship of all of the heritage assets throughout the Capitol campus. She also is very well educated with her PhD in art history from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and has been widely published especially from her work with the public schools in New York, talking about public art for public schools and how she met some of the particular challenges in interpreting that art and reinterpreting it. Michele has provided advice for several of the guests, who they should be, and background subjects for the podcast, and is the featured guest in one of the episodes. So that's who we have, an incredible group. So we're going to start with Janet. And Janet, we would invite you to discuss the basic outline of the project, the theme of the series, and how does this fit into the Capitol Visitor Center's educational efforts overall. Janet, take the stage.
Hi, Jane. Thank you for having me.
We're delighted to have you.
For inviting us. So, as you mentioned, I've been a visitor guide at the Capitol for some number of years, but this winter I had the opportunity to develop and host this podcast series. It focuses on the achievements of women in the art of the Capitol, both before, during, and after most women in the U.S. gaining the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. This year, 2020, we're celebrating the centennial of the ratification and passage of the 19th Amendment. And I started researching not only the women who are featured in the statuary of the Capitol, but also the women who made the statues. And while researching them, broad themes started to emerge. The struggles that women faced to start careers in the arts, but in other fields as well, the gendered barriers that they faced, competition they ran into for jobs, and becoming the focus of public attention, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes not so much. We found that women were could be labeled as troublemakers or sort of treated as outliers to society, and they were treated, particularly by the press and the public, as objects of fascination. It almost makes them sort of one-dimensional, especially with the earliest women, sort of our pre-suffrage ladies in the 19th century. They kept coming up against these cultural barriers, I guess you'd say, cultural ideas of where women could and couldn't go, or where they could and couldn't be. And the idea of kind of not only like a physical sense of where a woman's place is in the home, but also in the idea of what a woman's proper role was in public life. So the idea of women occupying space in three dimensions really kind of dovetails nicely together this idea of the kind of struggles that women historically have faced, these particular women, especially the artists, and it fits together so well with the sculpture that are on display in the Capitol. We're just so lucky to have some great resources at the Capitol that we could work with for this podcast.
Well, one of those great resources, Janet, we really appreciate your giving us that background, is Michele Cohen, who is the curator, and she can tell us about the collection and if you would share with us, Michele, your reflections on how to tell this story, because that is a piece of your job as well.
Right. Well, thank you for having me today. And I was very excited when the CVC launched this podcast, because public art especially, I think, is best understood when it can be contextualized. And so by launching this podcast, they were able to bring together myriad voices, historians and artists and descendants of some of the subjects that are being honored. And I think the public then can come away with a much sort of deeper understanding and a broader perspective on why this art is commissioned and what it means. So in addition to the sculpture collection, of course, we have an extensive collection of murals, but the focus of the podcast is really, as Janet said, about women who are occupying space. So it's about the physical presence of women in sculpture, as well as some of the artists who made these pieces, the women behind some of the other sculptures. And just sort of to give people an idea of the breadth, there are currently 9 statues in the Statuary Hall collection that celebrate women. 4 of those are by women artists. And then there are approximately 27 sculptures, individual busts, statues, and monuments by women that are on display throughout the Capitol. So what I particularly enjoyed about this podcast is that it's trying to look at both the subjects honored as well as the artists who created it. And it brings together a really interesting cross-section of scholars, of the artists themselves, of museum curators, and then of individuals who are family members who are connected to the subjects being honored. So for me, it's a very exciting opportunity to really educate the public in a broader way about art in the Capitol, and to see it through that lens of women, and particularly in light of the passage of the centennial of the suffrage amendment.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for putting this in context. And we want to hear from the producer. Marcey, you have taken on podcasting. You became a videographer, and now all of a sudden you've taken on a new task. And how do you tell this story without the visuals?
Yeah, so thank you. Podcasting for us is clearly a very new venture. We at the Visitor Center like to tell stories, whether it's through our Capitol tours or special programs or educational programs. We look to how we can best tell stories of the Capitol and the history of this country to a broad audience. So when we were kind of looking at different multimedia out there, one of the things that continuously comes up is podcasting. So with this being the 19th Amendment Centennial, and Janet had this rich resource already going of women in Capitol art, we decided to kind of take a really narrow focus of a podcast and see if we could reach a broader audience or a different audience to tell the story and the history of women's impact in the Capitol through this different technique. So I do want to give a quick shout out. I know one of our guest speakers is on the webinar right now. Jacqueline Deline McDonald is our guest speaker for episode 4 on Elsbeth Ney, which you can hear now. It's up on our website. Visit thecapitol.gov. You just hit on the podcast block at the top and you can see it there. And then I really just kind of want to give you guys we edited together a quick little snippet of 3 different episodes that kind of give you an idea of the broad themes and the different voices that we are trying to bring to light during this podcast series. So I'll go ahead and play that real quick.
Imagine winning an anonymous art competition, knowing you were judged strictly on talent. Now imagine it's 1870s America, and you're a woman.
Anne Whitney was much better known in her own lifetime than she is today. She was born in 1821 and she dies in 1915, which was a very long life for that time period. She, like most women of her time period, didn't have any real formal education, but she somehow got it in her head that she wanted to be a sculptor. And to do that as a woman in this time period was just astonishing if you think about it. This kind of intrepid nature that you had to have in order to put up with that level of discomfort, because it was a level of discomfort. They had no role models, right? They had no one doing it before them that they could model their behavior on.
Sarah Winnemucca was my great-great-grandmother, and she was a Native American woman advocate, which was unusual in her time. She was definitely a friend to her community. She was a visionary. She was very insightful and a very determined young woman who spoke well and communicated well, and her ability to navigate through the changing times was pretty amazing for a young woman in that time. I hope that people stop to learn more about her, because I think there's a lot of statues and people depicted in those statues that we need to know about. They're part of where we came from and how we became who we are.
At my birth, my mother named me artist. Very unusual. She had some insight. My mother, bless her heart, was so worried that she said I'd never make a living as an artist. I had to either be a teacher or to be a commercial artist. And as I say, I knew that the whole reason for my being here on earth was to follow the fine art field, be a fine artist. The sensitivities, not to please, but to be obedient to the inspiration that's coming to you as you create. I'm so strong on this idea of erasing that disrespect for the beauty of ebony-skinned, and also lack of equal respect for females. So I would hope that my portrayal of her sets a new standard for admiration, just visually and ethically.
From the first echoes of footsteps in the Capitol, women have been a part of the story. We've explored more than 150 years of women in Capitol art, and the journey is only just beginning. You're listening to Shaping History, Women in Capitol Art, produced by the Capitol Visitor Center. Our mission is to inform, involve, and inspire every visitor to the United States Capitol.
Wow. Marcey, you can see your love for video to sort of put the video and the podcast together. Tell people, how do they find the podcast series?
So our podcast series, you can find it on our website. If you go to visitthecapitol.gov, there's a block that said podcasts. If you hit on that, you will first see Michele Cohen wrote a beautiful introduction to the series, outlining kind of the series itself and the collection. So you can read that. And at the bottom there are blog posts associated with each podcast. So you can click on the different thumbnails and see and listen to episodes, as well as see a few visuals and read a little bit more about who they are and what they did. We're also up on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, as well as a number of different platforms. If you just search for Shaping History, we pop right up. So
great. Well, I'd like to invite our other panelists to come back into the conversation. There's Janet, there's Michele. I want each of you to tell me one at a time, what was your favorite podcast? What was your favorite story that you got in this podcast?
I mean, there are so many. We did 10 episodes. We could have done dozens. And there are a lot of stories that we touch on that I wish we could have devoted entire episodes to. There's one artist in particular. Her name is Evelyn Raymond. You'll hear a little bit about her in the Votes for Women tour episode. She sculpted a lady named Maria Sanford, who is herself a fascinating figure. She convinced her parents to give her the money that was meant for her dowry to use as tuition to send herself to school. So incredible figure, sculpted by this lady, Evelyn Raymond, who really reminded me of kind of both my grandmothers. She set about getting an education at a time when it was unusual for women. Evelyn Raymond was a writer as well as a sculptor. She had a big professional setback early in her career, a family emergency. She had to go home. Her mother was ill and ran a dairy farm. And there were hundreds of staff at the dairy farm that needed to be fed. So Evelyn Raymond gave up her sculpting for a couple of years and just worked churning out coffee and meals for a couple hundred people a day to keep her family's business afloat. Then she got to restart her career just in time for the Great Depression. She was lucky enough to be selected to work with the Federal Art Project and be supported in her work that way. And then when World War II ended, she actually became a really successful artist in the 50s. So just a fascinating lady, and her career touches on some of the themes that we saw with a lot of the other artists that we researched. There were other people that I wish I could have included and we didn't get to talk about much. in that end of that clip, you heard from the artist Lane. She's related to a lady named Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who's an abolitionist and first African-American woman to publish a newspaper in the United States that we know of. And she's also a DC related figure. So that would have been a great person to talk about as well.
Well, there's more time ahead for these opportunities. Marcey, what was your favorite story?
So I have to echo Janet. It's really hard to pick. I think I go around and say they're all my favorites. For me, a lot of this was new. I don't have a history background, so even just in recording these, I think I cried at like a number of the episodes because of the stories that I didn't know and are so touching and impactful. If I had, can I pick two? So I really like to hear the perspectives. For me, I love the Sherry Ellie Mendez interview when we talk about Sarah Winnemucca, because I do feel like her story, even when it was one of those stories we found out when we were researching that Sarah Winnemucca testified before the Indian subcommittee on Indian Affairs. So she was in the Capitol. So not only is she now a statue in the Capitol, but she was actually in the Capitol back in the 1800s. So to talk to her great-great-granddaughter about who this woman was and what her impact was on her community, which was controversial at the time, but also just to kind of bring it full circle to her being back at the Capitol and to her ancestors getting to come to the Capitol and watch her be honored in that way. It was such a touching experience. And then my other favorite is the Meet the Artists episode at the episode 10, where we got to speak with Deborah Copenhaver Fellows, who is the artist behind the Barry Goldwater statue, and artist Lane, who did the Sojourner Truth bust, to get to actually hear from the artists themselves about what it is to have that honor of creating a statue and what they want to convey in that moment, and just their struggles as women artists. Even today, for me, was I think are super important stories to be telling right now.
Thanks, Marcey. So Michele, I know it's dangerous. It's almost like asking a mother who's their favorite child. You're in charge of caring for all the art, but do you have a favorite statue, a favorite statue made by a woman, a favorite statue of a woman, and why?
Well, I do have a favorite statue. She's an allegorical figure, though. So it's the Car of History. And that's really one of our earliest pieces of public art, and it's in Statuary Hall. It was finished in 1819. And it depicts Cleo, the muse of history, and she's recording the events that she's witnessing in Statuary Hall as she looks across at the Speaker of the House. So it's at the time it was commissioned, it's where the House met, in that chamber. And it's a situation where it's public art that really transcends its time and still is as relevant today, I think, as the day it was commissioned. So, of course, it speaks to the fact that previously, the 19th century, most depictions of women were allegorical figures. They weren't people who had their own agency. They weren't recognizable people who had other roles in society. So what I love about the whole podcast series, of course, is showing how this has really dramatically changed, and how, if you even look at the women now serving in Congress, the numbers of women in the House of Representatives and the Senate higher than ever before. And I think a lot more women as well are getting commissions for a sculpture. So the podcast really comes, I think, at an extremely sort of opportune time to both recognize what the centennial of women's suffrage, but also to draw people's attention to this evolution of women, sort of their presence behind the scenes as well as at the forefront of art in the Capitol.
Good point. One of our questioners asked, they've only seen four of the podcasts so far, but you said there are 10. When do they come up and how do they find them? Who wants to answer that? Marcey, you want to answer that?
Sure, I'll take that. So they're being released once a week, every Tuesday. You can, if you subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, you'll automatically get a notification when they appear. You can also just check our website every week. They go up on Tuesdays. So.
Okay. Now we've got a new questioner, someone who's just come on, said, what about the Statue of Freedom? Is she modeled after a Native American woman? There's story that this particular questioner heard that she was looking toward England, or is that just fictional? How does the Statue of Freedom fit into this whole story? Maybe Michelle, you can handle that one.
Okay, sure. So that's by Thomas Crawford. That's a good example, of course, of how women are used as allegories. So it's an allegorical figure, and the symbolism of it is a synthesis, sort of a hybrid of different references to different traditions. So the fact that the figure is wearing a Native American headdress, and there are eagle claws that hang, the talons almost hang like earrings from their figure, but then she's also carrying a sword, and there is a banner that says e pluribus unum. So it's an example of an allegorical figure that the artist invented, drawing on these various traditions. It's not, the reason that it faces east is because the capital was really oriented to the east. I don't know that England, the idea that she's facing that far east plays into it. I think it had much more to do with the orientation of the building in relation to, of course, Washington, DC. So I'm sorry, was there another part to that question? Did I miss?
I think that was the question.
Yeah.
And that's very helpful. Here's another questioner is asking, as the states retire statues and add new ones, have any of the statues that were done by women been retired?
Yes, actually, I think there was one that was replaced prior to my arrival at the Capitol. So that happens. I mean, I think when states elect to replace a statue, it's very much to do about the figure that's being honored. And it's not, I don't think the artist plays as much into the decision process as to whether or not a statue is going to be replaced.
Mm-hmm. Now, this, I think maybe, Janet, is more for you and Marcey, which is, were there things you learned in making this podcast that surprised you? Janet, why don't you start, and then Marcey, you come back.
Sure. There were tons of surprises, big and small, I think. I was constantly coming up with things in my research that I was shocked by, connections between the individuals that were surprising to me. Several of the artists, were affiliated with the same teacher, as students early in his career and later in his career. One thing I have to say was a surprise to me, and I didn't reveal this at the time, but when I was interviewing Michelle, she said that the National Statuary Hall collection, the legislation to create it, the first draft was that the statues would be men. And then the final draft that ended up getting passed said persons of historic renown. And I've been talking about the National Statuary Hall collection with people for over a decade, and I had no idea that that was the case.
What year was that?
1864. Yeah, so wild for 1864, and which member said, hang on a second, I want to just cross out this one word and put something gender neutral in its place.
For me, like I said earlier, a lot of it is new to me, especially the history. I'll pitch our next episode. Episode 5 comes up tomorrow. It's Belmont Hall. We went to visit Susan Philippot, who's a park guide at Belmont Hall, to talk about the suffrage movement in connection with the Portrait Monument and that story. And for me, it actually was our first podcast interview that we did on location. And just to hear the story of the suffrage movement and all of the voices and the people who are part of it, or still part of it today, and were part of it back then, that don't get told, you can only make so many monuments and so many statues honoring so many women, but the movement itself was so deep, and it was so many voices that took part in it, both male and female. And so for me, it was that learning experience about both the suffrage movement, as well as I had never heard the story of the controversy that went around with the 36th state, and when they got to ratification, and how that story played out as to how the vote went down for Tennessee to be the 36th state to go ahead and ratify the 19th Amendment. So I won't tell you what the story is. You should listen to the podcast. But it was one of the ones where I was in tears, because the story is told so, Susan tells it so well, and it ties it so closely to multiple voices matter. That it's not just the women that held up the women's suffrage movement. There were so many voices and so many male voices that contributed and had a say and had to help push it forward. So I would listen to that tomorrow.
Well, Marcey, you're a very good promoter, I tell you. Now we're all anxious. But let me just ask this question. You were trained as a videographer. How hard was it to transfer from the visual images supporting the written word to a verbal, something that is really just words, presented in a way that people can draw their own mental pictures?
So it was a really hard experience. I mean, it's different. It's to learn something new. And I'll be honest, it is our first podcast. And so I think it's a learning experience in general for us. But we really rely on storytellers. And so it was the panelists, the guest speakers that we had really tell their stories in such wonderfully personal ways. Everyone we talked to was passionate and connected to their material. They've researched it, immensely. And there aren't very many out there who have researched some of these female artists. And so I think we really relied upon their voices and their passion to come through to help tell that story. So I can't take much credit for it, because it really is their words that paint that picture. And we had some amazing guest speakers who painted beautiful pictures for us. So it was really that.
What made you decide that it should be a podcast series rather than a visual series?
A large part of it is because I think the length of the stories that we wanted to tell, they're not, I personally didn't want to cut them into really small 2-minute, 3-minute video pieces. And I wanted to give them that breadth of really diving deep into these women's perspectives and the history and the knowledge in a way that I think might have been limited in trying to tell it in a social media or in a small kind of limited form. We weren't going to be doing like a 2-hour documentary. So these podcasts, I think the podcast platforms allows for people to have really in-depth conversations about things that matter. So I think it actually was the best way of telling these stories, is to give them that credit of really going deep into history and why these women mattered.
Well, and at this point, when everybody's form of exercise is to go out for a walk, no time like the present to put your earbuds in and listen to the podcasts. But one other question, as the producer, were there other podcasts that you looked at for inspiration and said, I really want to do a podcast that's like, somebody who else does great podcasts?
So I'm actually a big fan of NPR. I listen a lot to NPR podcasts. Snap Judgment is one of my favorites. I can't say that the series is like that one though, because it's much. I think that's a progressive stuff that we'd like to get to. And then we did a little research into Side Door, the Smithsonian podcast series. They have a number of podcasts from their different institutions, and so we listened to a few of those. And I think Janet actually has a number that she is a fan of as well. But those are my 2 big ones.
Janet, tell us yours.
Well, actually going into this, I hadn't listened to a lot of podcasts. I'm a fan of a couple of comedy ones, but there was one in particular that I found, which was called The Sculptor's Funeral. And it was a sculpture-focused podcast. With a single speaker, he does extensive research, and then he talks about a particular artist or a particular work, if it's a really big artist like Michelangelo or something like that. And I was interested in the way that he chose visuals to put alongside that and have them on the website. Because as you said, most people are listening to podcasts when they can't look at a screen, right? They're out taking a walk, or they're washing dishes, or, you know, any number of things. So I was interested in the idea of how do you paint a picture with words, and then also how do we supplement it with well-chosen images that they can look at later on.
So Michelle, what is your favorite podcast other than this, which is of course now your personal favorite?
Well, I've always been a big fan of Hourglass on NPR. So even my children got to listen to him quite a lot over the years. But I think that what I particularly like about using a podcast in this forum, and it's sort of along the lines, I think, of museum education, that it helps people really orient visually so that you're doing the looking, but then you're also getting your experiences being amplified by listening. But I think that it helps you focus on the object, because I really do believe that you could then, once the Capitol reopens, we can stand in front of any number of these statues and listen to the entire podcast. And I think that it will animate the sculpture for the viewer.
So these podcasts have life, not just this moment. But Michelle, one more question while we have you on the stage. Is there anything that's sort of different or unique about the art in the Capitol as opposed to other public art that you've dealt with?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important when you think about public art to think about who's the patron, who commissioned it, how did it get there, what was the constituency that caused the statue to come into being. And even within the Capitol, there are many different patrons. Not everything was commissioned by Congress. So the Statuary Hall collection really reflects state values. You've got 50 states that commission statues, and it also reflects values of a particular time period. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of changes now since 2000, when the law was passed that states could replace their statues. So I think seeing art in the Capitol, you're seeing it in the context of a place that really also informs its meaning. So public art, in a sense, is at a nexus of patron and place. And I think art in the Capitol illustrates that in a really grand way.
That's great. So one of the questions, maybe Janet, you should take this one, is what's your thought about when the Capitol reopens? Will you have a special tour that follows these podcasts?
Well, it's not my decision to make, but I would hope that there would potentially be a Women in Art tour sometime in the future. As it stands now, and folks take my free Capitol tour just every day, I do focus a lot on these artworks simply because I spend a lot of time thinking about them. And I want to say we also have, a few other things at the Capitol Visitor Center that are tied to the suffrage centennial. You'll hear in one of the later episodes a lot about our current Votes for Women tour, which we started offering last summer to bring attention to women, and we use the artworks, of course, on that tour. We have a little exhibit in Emancipation Hall, so when that reopens, hopefully people will get to see that. And we, when we created this podcast, we're also connected to the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission and their efforts, which are nationwide, to commemorate the events of 100 years ago.
That's great. And, just one thing to know is, of course, the Capitol Historical Society does expanded tours with historians, and we can do them on, specialty topics. And so we'll certainly use some of this to be able to do an expanded tour with the focus on the history of women. So those opportunities will be available when the Capitol opens once again for visitors, and we all band together as how we create a real opportunity for people to come. We have a question that's particularly for you, Dr. Cohen, from one of our redcoats, Ron Jackson, who wants to know, have you any word on when the statue of Mary McLeod Bethune is coming to represent Florida?
Well, I can confirm that this commission is in the pipeline, but I really can't give you a date when it will arrive and be unveiled. As you know, there are a lot of steps that a new statue has to go through. And of course, now things in terms of just convening a large group is a questionable practice. So I'm not quite sure when that will be in place, but it is in the pipeline. So it's in progress.
And can you tell us how long does it take to make a statue, and how much does the artist get paid for a statue that is quality to be in the Capitol?
Well, of course, that varies in terms of the cost, but we might tell a group that's, commissioning a statue to think about, several $100,000 that would be required to fund the commission, and then additional money to fund the actual dedication and the transport of it. So it's quite an expensive undertaking. In terms of time, if a statue is commissioned and it appears within 2 years, that would be a really fast timetable. Sometimes things have taken as much as 10 years because funding stalled and a project just didn't gain enough momentum. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of support and patronage, that all of these things are intertwined. So when an artist does a piece for themselves in their studio, funding's not the issue. They're doing it really for themselves, and they're not working necessarily with a committee that's weighing in on any of their artistic decisions. But when a sculptor is working on a statuary hall commission, they're working with a state group. They also require the approval of a joint committee on the library at each step of the way. Often they're guided by the commissioning group as to the appropriate age of the subject, some of the attributes they want that person to be holding, how they want them depicted. So in creating public art, you really have to almost think about it as a creative conversation between the artist and the group that's sponsoring the artwork.
So we're just coming to the end of our time, but we have a couple more questions. One of the questions is someone who's our questionnaire wrote and said, it appears that almost all of the replacement statues are coming in bronze. Is there any thought that any of the replacement statues will be in marble, or is that just an accident? Any thoughts about that?
Well, it's really up to the artist and the commissioning group, and the sculpture of Bethune, my understanding is that it will be marble. The guidelines stipulate a permanent material that the piece needs to be either bronze or marble, but it also has to do with artist training and the availability of marble. In the 19th century, more and more artists could work in that medium. Today, most artists are more comfortable working in bronze, partly because of the accessibility of it and the cost. It's a lower cost endeavor.
Janet, I think this one's for you. What other projects is the Capitol Visitors Center up to? Is there something else we should watch for?
Oh, there are a ton. I actually think maybe Marcey is the one to answer this, because those are the most forthcoming immediately.
Okay, Marcey, tell us.
Sure. So right now we are working on an 8th grade video tour that follows the 8th grade curriculum and the We the People concept that I think the U.S. Capitol Historical Society works with the Capitol Visitor Center on those tours. So there's an 8th grade video tour we're doing. We're also doing a series on the state statues on the National Statuary Hall collection. So we're going to be featuring each a video featuring each of the state statues. We're working The first 50 were working from the date the states entered the Union. So those will start coming out in the next few months as well.
Oh, that's great. And I mean, the other thing that's going on for those who are interested in the Statuary Hall collection is that Michele is working with the Society to try to create a book on the Statuary Hall collection, who the people are, who the artists were. And so we're in the process of doing that with the hope that we will have a draft within the next several months and try to get into production in 2021 of that book. And it will have a companion web series, because by the time you publish a beautiful cocktail table book, invariably something's going to change. So we're going to have a web component that will certainly link these videos, and so that we can catch it in both places. And then the everlasting question, which comes to us every time, is, does anyone know what day the U.S. Capitol is going to reopen to the public? And the answer is no. None of us know. That decision will be made by the United States Congress in consultation with the best public health advice and the Capitol physician, architect of the Capitol. There's a specific committee that works on that. And trust me, as soon as we know, the Capitol Historical Society will tell. I am confident that the Capitol Visitor Center will quickly be telling you how to access the Capitol. And I would invite anyone who's interested to continue to pursue the website, both of the Capitol Historical Society and of the Capitol Visitor Center, both for resources that are available when we can't go to the Capitol, and for information about the reopening of the Capitol when that time comes, when we're able to go back in again. I want to thank each of you for being with us. And I want to thank Michele. I want to thank you for the work that you do with the Capitol Historical Society on so many things, particularly on the Statuary Hall book. And Marcey and Janet and the whole crew at the Capitol Visitor Center are an extraordinary partner to the Capitol Historical Society. You talked a little bit about the We the People Constitution Tour, which we've now been doing for 14 years. 20,000 students have taken that tour that covers the Capitol, the Supreme Court, the White House Visitor Center, the National Archives, and the George Mason Memorial. And we're looking ahead, trying to figure out how we can provide some of that digitally, because it will be more difficult for people to do field trips in the time ahead. But as we do that digitally, it will mean that it can be available to students across the country. So we try to find some joy in the trauma of being locked in and locked out. And we bring the Capitol and the values to each and every person who we're able to touch. Thank you for being with us. And for all of you, remember, thank you for your support. These are only available because you support the Capitol Historical Society. We appreciate your engagement, your opportunity. The video will be available eventually on our website, but short term, if you're registered, you'll get a note, and so you'll be able to look at this video. Thank you so much. Goodbye.